We have the challenge of trying to identify some of the ways in which we can move ahead on many of the issues touched on today and touched on in the papers that form the basis for the discussion today. We're very lucky to have two terrific panelists with us to launch this last discussion of the day. We have Melanie Nezer to my direct left, who I think many of you know is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for HIAS. Melanie is really one of the sharpest advocates on the Hill on refugee issues, and it's been my pleasure to work with her for many years. Before joining HIAS, she was the Immigration Policy Director for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants and a co-editor of Refugee Reports. She is a lawyer from Boston College Law and also authored one of the pieces that are in the back today. Then to Melanie's left is Tara Magner. Tara is a program officer with the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. But for most of us, we will remember her as our hero when she worked as the senior counsel to Senator Patrick Leahy as chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary. Her responsibilities there included immigration, refugee protection, human rights, and national security matters. She was also a member of President Obama's Transition Policy Working Group on Immigration. She also served on the ABA's Commission on Immigration and authored a wonderfully informative piece along with me on asylum, statelessness, and other issues, and that's in the back of the room. So let me begin by thanking both of our panelists for being here with us today. And just to ask each of them to comment just briefly on what we're charged with talking about in this last panel, which is some key areas for change to make a stronger U.S. refugee protection system, and maybe we'll broaden that to a stronger U.S. protection system, talking legislatively, but also maybe administratively a bit as well. Melanie, you want to start?
Great, thanks Eleanor, and thanks Dawn and CMS. It's such an honor to be on this panel with these two powerhouse women on refugee and asylum issues. So today, we're kind of tasked with kind of wrapping it up and talking about next steps. So we've talked about a lot of problems. I think we could all be very sad and depressed at the end of this long day about what people are suffering kind of through the inadequacies of our system. But we could also be energized because it gives us an opportunity to really identify some of the things that we can make progress on and come up with a plan, hopefully together, to make those changes. I mean, maybe that's what's missing. There doesn't seem to be a real movement. I mean, we're doing some great work, but we really need to be more coordinated and have a real, movement for change on these issues, because otherwise we're up against a lot of challenges that we're not going to be able to overcome. So I think that's really what the call to action for today. We've heard all of these great ideas. Let's see what we can do to actually make change. So a couple of the provisions that have kind of floated to the top legislatively, and by that I mean have actually been introduced in legislation, some have actually passed the Senate, that we can maybe hone in on or use as something that we could start making progress. We have a list of them. One of them is the Wattenberg-like provision, which is in the Senate bill. It is a provision that would, along the lines of the Wattenberg Amendment, which actually allows certain categories of mostly religious minorities to get refugee status in the U.S. based on their membership of a particular group. So the benefit of this provision is that when a member of this group is interviewed, the DHS officer doesn't have to go through all of the bases of the claim. Like the person doesn't actually have to prove individualized persecution. It's that the administration has made a determination that this person is a member of this historically persecuted group, and for that reason should get refugee status. So that when DHS goes in and does the interview, it's not about adjudicating the asylum claim or the refugee claim, it's about admissibility and security issues and those kinds of things. So it's an efficiency, it's a model of efficiency, and it also allows for different types of claims to be admitted. You don't have to necessarily meet the exact refugee standard, it can be a different standard. So that has worked very well historically for refugees from the former Soviet Union. It now covers refugees, religious minorities from Iran. And there is a provision in S744 which would allow the president, right now it can only be Congress that designates these groups, it would allow the president to designate the groups in consultation with Homeland Security and Secretary of State. So it's one of these mechanisms that would allow for more flexibility to admit people of humanitarian concern or people who should be admitted as refugees in the national interest. So that's one of the provisions that actually made it through the Senate bill. It has bipartisan support. Anything that's in the Senate bill, I guess, by definition would have bipartisan support. And it has a history and a track record. It's been, the Wattenberg Amendment itself has been on the books for many years, since, I guess, 25 years. Actually, today is the anniversary of Senator Wattenberg's death. He died a year ago, and I have an op-ed and roll call today asking Congress to support that provision of S744. So that's one of the provisions that we've gotten some traction on. I also want to talk about refugee resettlement issues and improving the resettlement process. You heard a lot about that today in earlier panels. The Refugee Protection, S744 does have some provisions that address that. They're not as specific as what's needed to really fix the process. There are bills out there that do go into more detail and would address some of these more long-standing issues, such as formula funding, how is ORR funded. Representative Ellison has a bill that would do that. The Refugee Protection Act has a provision in there that would do that. Provisions addressing secondary migration, which is a big concern for certain members of Congress, refugees that are resettled someplace and then go someplace else and don't have services for them. That's in there as well. And then there's a provision in S744 that it kind of increases due process for people seeking refugee status in the U.S. So for people overseas, they would be eligible to bring counsel to their interviews, and also get very detailed reasons for any denials of refugee claims, things that we're used to in the asylum context but are absent from the refugee context. That provision actually, and this kind of shows you how important it is to get the legislation out there, even if it's a very difficult and challenging process for getting it through Congress. That little piece of S744 was actually enacted in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013, but limited to Iraqi and Afghan SIVs and some Afghan refugees. So just having these things, I mean, many of these provisions in S744 that Tara is also going to talk about were in the Refugee Protection Act, which was introduced by Senator Leahy during the past few Congresses, but it's in this Congress as well. So just having those seeds planted and building some of that support in Congress, even if it's not something that's going to get enacted tomorrow, it's really critical, because when there is moving legislation, that's where these things are pulled from. Members of Congress want to pull from legislation that it's actually already been introduced and considered and vetted to some extent. So those are two of them, but there are more provisions that are kind of floating to the top that Tara will talk about.
Okay, jump in. Great. All right. Well, I want to extend my thanks also to Center for Migration Studies, Don, Brianna, Rachel, and the whole team for putting this day together. And thanks to everyone in the audience for persevering to the bitter end with us. The MacArthur Foundation, where I'm currently employed, does not engage in legislative work or advocacy of any kind. So today I'm speaking in my personal capacity only and not representing the views of the foundation. But it is a panel about policy and legislation, so I'll do my best to walk that fine line. But I'd like to build on where Melanie just left off, which is to say that for those who do follow Congress carefully and watch these bills move over time, over many Congresses, each successive step forward, however small, and they often feel minuscule, do represent advances. And so, for example, the Refugee Protection Act was introduced for a couple of Congresses without any further action, and struggled to obtain bipartisan support. However, when the Gang of Six was putting together the bipartisan bill that became S744, bipartisan members of that group borrowed from the bill and put provisions into the introduced version of the bill. And then those provisions survived the committee debate and markup and committee vote, which was also bipartisan, and then survived the floor debate and vote, which was also bipartisan. So for the legislative mavens in the audience, we call that regular order. And regular order is something that one can build upon in the future. Because a bill that has been introduced with no hearings, no votes, no nothing, it's hard to say you've built any traction on it. But for something like a bipartisan bill that has gone through extensive regular order, people can pick up those provisions later and try to use that as leverage to advance the issues. So a couple of other provisions that I think fall into this category, in addition to the ones that Melanie discussed. First and foremost, repeal of the one-year filing deadline for asylum seekers in the United States. As I'm sure you all know, when asylum seekers enter the US and ask for protection, they have to file an application within 1 year of the date of their arrival. There are a couple of exceptions which are challenging to meet in and of themselves. But that law, that part of the law has been on the books since 1996 and was passed in part due to fears of fraud or frivolous claims at that time. Research by scholars at Georgetown and Temple found, however, that between 1998 and 2009, 15,000 applicants for asylum were denied protection under the asylum provisions because of missing the filing deadline, but nonetheless went on to win their claims under the tougher standard of withholding of removal, which suggests very strongly that their original claim was valid, and but for the 1 year filing deadline would have won asylum in the first place. And so legislation is required to remove the filing deadline, and it's been a struggle for those who support that repeal to achieve a repeal in the law. It's not something that the agencies could do on their own. However, in recent years, there has been some traction gained on this issue. The Obama administration has come out in formal support of a repeal, has spoken on the record in favor of it, saying that the deadline results in the denial of asylum to genuine refugees, that the deadline expends resources at the asylum office and in the immigration courts that could be more efficiently spent in simply adjudicating cases in the asylum office in the non-adversarial setting, and does little to deter fraud, but makes the overall process more difficult. And so with the Obama administration support and the immigration bill having passed the Senate last summer, there is some hope for those advocating for this repeal that it can be accomplished at some point. The second issue I'd mention is, as was brought up in the last panel by Mary Ellen, is the legislation to address the issue of stateless persons within the United States. This is a relatively small population, but a population for whom there is no avenue to legal status. And the Department of Homeland Security has spoken in favor of some legislative fix because they recognize for many of these people, they're stateless through no fault of their own. There's nothing they have done to deserve that status, and there's nothing the government can do to help them. And so again, the Senate bill that passed last year had a statelessness fix in the base bill, in the committee version, in the Senate passed bill. And I don't think that provision has attracted much controversy at all. There were a few tweaks between the introduced version and the passed version, I believe. But that's another one where there is some potential for progress. And why don't I stop there and see where Eleanor takes us next.
I'm going to stand up here just to make sure none of you are falling asleep, but also because this is where the third mic is. I want to just follow up with each of you on a couple of the issues that we've talked about, additional issues we've talked about during the course of the day today. And one of the issues that was raised in a couple of the panels are the sort of the gaps in protection, the problems with the TPS statute. Is there a chance to get any of these challenges fixed? And what about maybe other measures that are administrative rather than legislative to address some of these gaps? So a couple of the suggestions raised in the papers and during today's discussions include potentially tweaking the TPS statute, maybe a provision that would allow folks who have been here in TPS status for 10 years to become legal permanent residents. Also a suggestion of creating a new type of protection visa, and then also a range of other potential flawed but approaches of, well, for some folks who are facing risk but don't need the refugee definition, what about using humanitarian parole? What about using other kinds of administrative measures that leave people not deported, working, but otherwise in limbo? So thoughts on that, I guess, and particularly against the backdrop of the pressure we've got right now on the border, which we'll talk about a bit more.
Sure. On some of these, I think the real challenge for the administration in particular, because some of these changes could be done administratively rather than require legislation, I think the challenge is for those in government who would like to ensure protection is provided. They might consider something like an expansion of humanitarian parole or reinterpretation of certain elements of TPS if they thought that it would not create a giant pull factor such that more individuals would come, that the pressure on the border would increase. And so I certainly do not mean to speak for the administration, but my sense is that in the context of discussions over the surge of children arriving at the southern border, officials in government are very keen to hear good ideas from NGOs, experts, and practitioners, as long as they're pragmatic and realistic and take all of the responsibilities of government agencies, including law enforcement responsibilities of government agencies, into account. So I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but I think the sense is that there is room for conversations about new and creative ways of addressing some of these challenges.
I want to comment on that from kind of the political perspective. So I think a lot of these things are, viable ideas. I mean, the ideas raised in Dawn's paper are kind of new. They're not the things we've been talking about for a long time, but they're common sense approaches to these long-standing problems that make a lot of sense. I don't think anyone would argue that they don't. I think in terms of how to get things done, when I did the review of all the pending legislation for my paper, which is basically, my paper is not really making a point so much as really giving an outline of everything that's out there and everything that's gone through the process. One of the things I found of what worked, what actually has gotten enacted in the last few years, it's very targeted, tends to be very targeted, narrow fixes intended to fix a particular problem. So, and then with surrounding political support. So, the terrorism bars, which Tara may have tried to talk about, many of you know what that's all about. It's kind of a confusing, basically it's a series of laws that were enacted after 9/11 that really make it very difficult even for legitimate refugees to get refugee or asylum status if they have any connection at all to terrorism, even if it really in real life doesn't make a whole lot of sense and isn't really connected to terrorism. But there was a legislative fix to that back in 2007. Senator Leahy worked with Senator Kyle and got this provision enacted that would make it easier to get an exemption from the administration from the bars to asylum and refugee status. And why did that happen? Well, there were certain particular populations that there was a lot of constituency that was concerned about them. So Hmong and Montagnards who fought with us during the Vietnam conflict, we had veterans come out for them. Burmese, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities that were fighting the Burmese regime. Well, members on both sides of the aisle realized that those people weren't terrorists. So it was like there were certain populations that really kind of touched a nerve. People really understood how this was unfair. The Iraqi and Afghan SIV provisions, these are also populations that, it's not a partisan issue. I mean, these are people that, it makes sense for the American, for the Congress to deal with and to try to help. If you look at other legislation that's been pending for Tibetan refugees, Indonesian Christians, I mean, these are small populations, but they always keep cropping up in legislation. The Tibetan provision is actually in the Senate immigration bill. So you see that it's kind of narrowly focused on solving a particular problem for a particular population, which maybe gives us some opportunities. I hate to say that, the UACs on the border is a good thing, because it's not. But maybe if we look at this as, trying to get some of our priorities done through the lens of this crisis, we could pick a few things that would address some of these issues for the UACs now that it's become, this humanitarian issue that the country is becoming very aware of. The president just said it was a humanitarian crisis. Maybe that's an opportunity to actually get something done. I know in terms of the Syrian refugee crisis, I mean, there's no legislation yet, but at a hearing a few months ago that Senator Durbin held, Senator Graham and Senator Cruz were very interested. I mean, really grilled the administration about why we aren't doing more, to help these people. So maybe there's, in the context of that, trying to throw in some of these long-standing problems and fix them through that lens. So that's where some of these issues that we've been talking about today, maybe that's a way to get some traction. And again, maybe not get legislation enacted, but to get these provisions starting to grow through the process and possibly sometime through the regular order. Another thing that would do is, even though we're not anticipating any of this legislation to pass, I mean, given the composition of the current Congress, particularly obviously in the House, it gives the administration some cover if you have bipartisan legislation that's even introduced on some of these issues, even if it's not enacted, if the administration wants to improve the system and make some of these changes, whether it's on interdiction or TPS or anything that's in their jurisdiction to do, to be able to say that, you know, a bipartisan group of members of Congress supports it gives them some cover, so they don't have to worry about being attacked for something, you know, being called, you know, being impeached, or being called, you know, soft on terrorism, or, you know, opening the border just because they want to improve some of these procedures. So it really serves those two functions.
So we're here in New York, and so I always find myself a little bit sort of a few steps behind Washington. It'd be good to get from you all a little bit of your perspectives on, you know, the perennial question of, so really what is the chance now? Melanie, I heard you say, you know, no one's expecting anything. I keep reading about these windows of opportunity for, you know, 3 weeks in the summer before everyone goes on vacation. So give us your thoughts there, and then maybe pivot off to talk with us a little bit about, you know, what are some of the challenges really? What are some of the impediments that are, you know, preventing or making progress difficult on these issues in particular, on the protection issues? That would be really helpful.
I live in Chicago.
Melanie, do you want to start and then pass on to Tara?
Yeah, sure.
I think Tara in particular will talk about the impediments.
As aware of the challenges as anyone, even from Chicago. But I mean, I think there are a number of things. In terms of immigration reform, is 744 going to be enacted? No. I mean, not today. I mean, eventually, yes, something like it. I mean, I think it's kind of historic. We're getting towards that moment eventually, but it's not going to be this year, and it's probably not going to be looking at the next couple of years and the predictions for the elections, probably not the next, you know, 2 years. But eventually, yes. I think that, you know, one of the challenges is that we don't have a movement or momentum on refugee and asylum issues. I think if you polled, you know, 100 Americans and you said list your top 20 issues of concern, things that you care about, you know, is refugees and asylum seekers going to be on that list? Probably not. I think it's the whole debate about immigration reform is instructive here, because as much as we like to think this is about doing the right thing, you know, and of course there have been many people in Congress and all across the country that have wanted immigration reform and have fought for it for the last 20-something years. The only reason it has traction now is because it's a political issue. I mean, Latinos now have power, their voices are being heard. The humanitarian factors have been here for many years. It's always been, you know, the policy prescriptions have been discussed, legalization, I mean, I don't know how many years. But the reason we're getting as close as we are to CIR, and the reason we are eventually going to get there, is because it's a political issue. There's pressure. Members of Congress are hearing from their constituents. They're hearing from faith groups. They're hearing from business groups. They're hearing from Microsoft. They're hearing from everybody. So, I mean, we do have these political issues that are temporarily blocking it, but eventually there is going to be enough of a groundswell that it's going to happen. We have to kind of create that. We're not going to be on the same scale as immigration reform. We're just not, we don't have a constituency that's big, but we do need to make much more noise about this and really get this to be more of a grassroots movement, which goes back to kind of what Anastasia and others were saying on that panel about getting the churches more involved, really getting back to our roots as this being a public-private partnership where we have communities really welcoming refugees and really understanding what the program is about and being proud of it, and being proud of, you know, this country's humanitarian traditions and the fact that we do this. I think we have to make that case, and I know that's a topic of discussion amongst many of us who do this work. So I think, but that's an obstacle. We don't have that political grassroots groundswell. I mean, everyone should go home and call their members of Congress and say, just, I care about refugees. They don't hear that at all. So that's one issue. There are others.
Sure, I think in the short term, because the House has made it clear that it won't take up conference with the Senate bill, any legislation that might be enacted by the end of the current Congress at the end of this calendar year is not likely to start with the provisions of S744 that reflect refugee protection, statelessness protection, et cetera. Those are not likely to be up for debate, right? If the House and Senate had gone to conference over a version of S744, those provisions might have been in the base bill from which they negotiated. But starting with either a package of House passed bills or some informal conference that generates a new bill from scratch, it would be hard for advocates of those provisions to have them added into the discussion at this point. I think a real challenge in the very short term are the conditions on the border, and for those advocating for the children, for asylum seekers on the border, to make sure that members of Congress are well educated and what those populations represent, what they're fleeing, what the protection concerns are, such that they're not immediately dismissed as new hordes of undocumented immigrants trying to enter the country. And I think there's a danger of that narrative taking hold. And I know that the groups that work on unaccompanied immigrant children issues are very closely engaged now with the groups advocating for comprehensive immigration reform to make sure that all of their efforts are mutually reinforcing, which seems like a smart way to proceed given the political dynamics. In the long term, I think Melanie is absolutely right. Several years ago, when I still worked on the Hill, there was a UNHCR-sponsored Refugee Congress Day or Congress Week, or there were several days where refugees came together, met with one another, talked about their own agenda for reform, and then came up and went to visit their members of Congress. And many of them were saying, yes, I'm a refugee, but now I'm also a citizen, and I vote, and I've started a small business, in our case, in Burlington, Vermont, and I've raised 3 children and put them all through college, and they're doing this, and they're doing that. And the message was incredibly compelling. Now, Senator Leahy didn't have to be convinced, but a lot of members of Congress do, and I don't think that they hear from that constituency very much. And so it is probably a small percentage of any member of Congress's constituency, but for those who vote and are entrepreneurial, are great citizens, raising great families. St. Louis, Missouri has a business innovation group. It's not the Chamber of Commerce, but some other organization. And they have studied how mostly Bosnian resettled refugees have completely revitalized areas of the city that were largely blighted. And you see the same things in lower income areas of Burlington, Vermont, and other areas of the country. So I think that getting those success stories out would also be a very powerful way of changing the narrative about refugee protection.
I think that advocates for refugees have gotten much more savvy about that lately, and I really have seen that that's an imperative. I know UNHCR is not willing to let that Refugee Congress be a one-time thing. They came back, and now they're trying to help support, and Shelley could talk more about this, support really turning that group into its own advocacy group so that they can continue to speak out on issues that are important to them, and so it's not a one-time visit. So they are really working on trying to support that and cause that to grow, and that is a really tremendous and effective group. There are also kind of very interesting things much going on at a local level, which is kind of where it has to happen. I'm just thinking of a couple of things. Impact studies where local groups have teamed up with universities and other researchers to show the positive economic impact of refugees on their communities, which has, if you look kind of like the whole Midwest, you've got mayors all over saying, we want these refugees, they've been great for our towns, they've been really revitalizing our cities. So we need more of that, and more of that kind of bubbling to the surface. There's this really innovative program that I thought was amazing that it should be happening everywhere. I believe in Kansas City, where they're partnering like refugees of certain skills and professional backgrounds with Americans with the same backgrounds. So, for instance, they're partnering engineers with refugee engineers with U.S.-based, American engineers, so that, what the woman who, that's running this said was that the person's not a refugee anymore. They interact as an engineer, so that helps kind of, and then you introduce the local population to refugees on those terms. So there are a lot of different ways where that's happening in local communities, but it's still kind of new and it's not totally organized, and it really needs to be brought together and lifted up. We, the national voluntary agencies, most of us have partnered together with help of some foundation support to start this program. We call it the TLC project, the Linking Communities Project. We have pilot projects in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where we are really trying to engage all kinds of stakeholders, including educators, healthcare providers, elected officials, refugees themselves, refugee resettlement agencies, to work together to promote resettlement in their own communities. And so part of the message is this is an economic boon to local communities, and another is this is something to be proud of. This is we are rescuing people. And I think Anastasia alluded to it earlier. This is not the era where we had thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people coming from the former Soviet Union, where you had the Jewish community engaged and pushing for resettlement, or the Vietnamese, where you had all the churches involved. I mean, we really have a lot of work to do to explain to the American people why we're doing this. But I think we have, obviously, a very compelling story to tell. But that's all happening. But it's going to be, we're not obviously where the immigration reform movement is. We're smaller, but it's happening, and I think it's key to building support for the program. That said, I mean, there's been a lot of problems identified, but we're still, I mean, even after 9/11, we were able to rebuild the refugee program. There was a lot of fear after that it would never come back, but it did. So I think that gives us hope that we can continue to build support for that and for a fair and humane asylum system as well.
That's great. So we've been talking a little bit about opportunities for legislative action, some of the impediments and some of the strategies that we need to employ to move some of this forward. But, turning to administrative, what the administration itself can do, Tara, I know issues like the social group regulation. We had some discussion earlier, I think, on gang-based cases and other cases that are domestic violence cases that are having a tough time in some because of some recent decisions. What's your sense, for how many years, I don't know how many years it's been since, I guess, Janet Reno left office, that we've been waiting for regulations on social groups. So what is the problem? Why can't these things ever move forward? Anything, it seems, that takes, administrative action, you've got DHS and DOJ and ICE and CIS and CBP, and, it's such an alphabet soup, but things are slow to come out. So, what's your thoughts on prospects for that regulation to move forward, and other administrative measures to maybe respond to some of the challenges we've been talking about today?
On the social group regs, I think it's a great mystery, right? Because Janet Reno put out the draft regulations in 2000. 14 years have gone by. We haven't seen a new set issued in, I think, 2010. Secretary Napolitano told Congress that the regs were being drafted, that they were a high priority, but that it's been 4 years and she's moved along. The rumor mill suggests that there is a debate going on within government over the merit of these heightened requirements that have been described by Mark earlier for the social visibility, particularity, etc., and that there are some people within the administration who would like to see those heightened requirements in the regs, and there are some who would like to not see them in the regs. And I think until that internal debate is settled, we may not see the regs. I don't have any insider information on this. Probably a dozen people in the room know more than I do about the state of play there. But I think that is, it's unfortunate because advocates and practitioners articulate case after case where people who, especially those who are the most vulnerable, LGBT asylum seekers, victims of gender and domestic violence, and those who are targeted by gangs are having the hardest time making those claims. What's curious is during the Bush administration, Homeland Security itself was putting out some very positive signs toward improved policy in briefs, in cases. So they don't count as regs, they don't count as guidance, but they were fairly forthright in recommending, excuse me, paths that asylum seekers could take in pursuing a claim and defining the social groups that might be acceptable to the adjudicators. But it seems like that's been stalled. So short of a couple of good briefs that can be cited, there's nothing more solid on that front. Now, the Refugee Protection Act tried to solve this problem by redefining the social group as that standard articulated in matter of ACOSTA. But that is a provision that was not incorporated in the Senate bill, has not been formally endorsed by the administration. So it is sort of at step one of being a legislative suggestion that may or may not influence the administration.
And another area that I think we've touched on a little bit are the immigration courts, and of course counsel, which we've spoken about throughout the day. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the potential for immigration court reform. including thoughts and recommendations for better funding for the immigration court so that asylum seekers and others are not waiting 3 years for their hearing dates. And any thoughts, sort of looking forward, and there's been some discussion on council ideas today, both for unaccompanied minors as well as, for others. What are the challenges on moving forward some reforms to fund council, and what are some strategies and ideas that we might all think about as we try to make some of our goals here a reality over the longer term.
Sure.
I'll just say I commend to everyone the 2010 report by the ABA Commission on reform of adjudication across the board, not just the courts, but all of the adjudicatory systems, which was issued under Karen Grisey's leadership when she was still serving as chairman of the commission. It is as comprehensive as anything you might imagine, and is really a roadmap to reform. The Senate bill does contain a number of provisions for immigration court reform. The 2006 immigration bill, also bipartisan, contained a number of reforms to the immigration courts, increased staffing, increased budgets, and so on. It seems to me that given, let me put it this way, whatever a member of Congress believes about how the courts should function, whether they should function to move cases quickly such that those who are subject to deportation can be removed, or whether they function to serve due process and ensure that those with valid claims can be given status, either of those goals are served by well-functioning and efficient courts. And no one is served by the current system where the judges and the system is backlogged and clogged with cases with low staffing, very little support staff, and so on. And so it has always seemed to me like an issue that should be nonpartisan, not to say bipartisan.
Yeah, I would say that might be a good opportunity if we are going to do any legislative change, especially in the context of what's going on the southern border, because there were a couple of hearings in the winter in the House Judiciary Committee where one was called, they're very kind of, the headline, like asylum fraud, asylum fraud in
America's
the system.
compassion.
Right, Eleanor was a witness, and then there was another one that was, just obviously you knew where they were going with these hearings. But the one thing that there seemed to be resounding agreement on, and I think it really was the one thing, was that there should be more resources for the courts, because there's no reason why an asylum case should take 3 years. So that was, there are budget constraints, but this is an emergency. This is a crisis. Maybe that's something that could be addressed. So it does seem like, any legislation would have to be compromise legislation, so we'd have to consider what we might have to give up on the other side. But that does seem like something that we could possibly accomplish in the frame of what's going on right now on the southern border, because, like Tara said, nobody thinks that this is a good thing that we have these 3-year delays with in our immigration courts.
So we wanted to open up the discussion to folks here who've been participating actively all day. Some questions are, what issues have we missed? What other impediments are there? Any other opportunities? Questions? Please come up and join us.
So Tara bailed me out this morning, so I'm gonna ask the first question. So I really like the idea of we have this crisis in Syria, which is a shameful thing, and everybody's regarding it as a horribly shameful thing. And we have this terrible problem with unaccompanied minors that has to be fixed. There's no way to avoid that. And so the issue is, do either of these crises allow us to move forward in a positive way, and in a way that would allow us to create real constituencies. And I guess I wanted to put that question back to you all, because that sounded like a very, very promising kind of confluence of things, horrible problems that need to be fixed, that everybody now is at the point where they recognize they need to be fixed. And the constituents are refugees, and who else on unaccompanied minors, and what would the fixes possibly be? Thanks.
Great.
I think that's probably our best way forward. In terms of the Syrian refugee crisis, I mean, I think that has become part of the public consciousness. There's a lot of work we would all be needing to do together, and having legislation would be helpful because it's a great organizing tool. But I know there has been some talk about this on the Hill, but I think that's an opportunity. And again, faith communities, the general public, I think it just resonates with a lot, I think, a broad swath of the American public. It's just a question of getting the message out there. But I think it's enough in people's consciousness that it's something that we could actually build on. And in terms of what goes in that legislation, it depends on what kind of, if it's going to be bipartisan, it's going to be constrained, but we can still do a lot of good, I think, in that. And do you want to talk about the UAC?
Sure. I guess just one more point on the legislation that passed in the National Defense Authorization Act. And Melanie mentioned it allows refugees to be given, those seeking refugee status to be given reasons for denial if they are denied, which is not typically provided to someone seeking refugee status, and also to be represented by counsel or another representative if they would like to bring someone to their interview. Those changes are limited now to Iraqis and Afghans, but if those changes are implemented in ways that make the system function better, that do not in any way impede the US government's ability to process these claims, that alone might form the foundation for expansion of that to other individuals seeking protection from other countries, so that it is maybe eased in over time more broadly. On the unaccompanied minors, I think many of the groups that work on the issue have been making recommendations to the government for a long time for things like having child-specific dockets within the immigration courts, judges that are that volunteer to take the children's cases and receive special training in the types of claims they bring, enabling service providers like pro bono attorneys, child advocates, or social service providers to interact with the children on those special days at the immigration courts, such that their services can be provided to the children in a facilitated manner. The courts don't provide the services, but they might make a room available such that the children can interact with the NGOs in a way that's more efficient, and before the children are released to family members who may not fully understand the system and the requirements to come back to court. So a lot of these recommendations have been made to the government over many years by groups like KIND and LIRS and others that are here today. I think that the crisis on the border has changed the dynamic such that the government is much more receptive to those kinds of recommendations. I wouldn't say they were unreceptive in the past, but it does seem like the opportunities are much greater now because the pressures are so much more significant. And like Melanie said, no one thinks that the surge in child migrants is a positive thing, but there may be some systemic reform that grows out of it. Because everything has to be taken under consideration, both from a protection stance, but also from a resource stance and a sort of pragmatic, efficient, effective functioning of the system. And so I think that we may see reforms on the children's issues more quickly than others because the pressure on the border is so intense right now.
It would be really helpful to get some positive signs from Congress in a bipartisan way that they support those kinds of reforms, and that's unfortunately not what we're hearing from the House Judiciary Committee, so it's going to take a lot of work, I think, at least for us to maybe identify a few things that we can get some support for, some bipartisan support for on the Hill. Because what we're hearing now is, well, it's fraud, and the problem is that they're coming over the border, not the problem is that they are being forced to leave and the factors that are causing them to leave. So we need to change that narrative a bit, I think, in order to help the administration make these changes and just do a lot of educational work on the Hill. Question?
Hi, Michael Cooper with the Plowshare Group. Earlier this morning, Margaret Stock and others encouraged us to sort of take a step back and think in a more holistic way about some of these issues and problems. And she suggested, for instance, that one of the biggest problems with the asylum system is the broken immigration system. At the same time, those of us on the left have been really pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, while on the right they've been encouraging us to sort of break this into more manageable packets, if you will. So one of my questions is, when we step back and look at the larger strategy here, if comprehensive immigration reform is this sort of big apple tree, I think all of us in the room could come up very quickly with sort of 50 kind of low-hanging fruit apples around that tree that we could go and pick off very easily because they're great ideas and they would get bipartisan support. But my question is, if we go around and pick those 50 sort of great, very ripe, golden, delicious apples, are we, in the end, just kicking comprehensive immigration reform down the road? So is it a good idea to all pull our forces together and really push for comprehensive immigration reform, or go for these, what have been called, I guess, tweaks in an ad hoc fashion?
Well, I guess the conventional argument for keeping reform comprehensive is often the argument that certain issues help carry the reform forward, and without those you won't achieve passage. So, for example, in past years there were debates over, well, should the DREAM Act be brought up as a standalone bill? It might pass, it might become law, but if that is passed, will that then take away from the support you would otherwise get for a comprehensive bill if the DREAM Act were in it, right? So I think the cynical part of me would argue that the asylum and refugee provisions are not carrying the comprehensive immigration reform toward the finish line the way that certain other provisions might. You know, vast constituencies in favor of a legalization program, vast constituencies in favor of E-Verify, right? So I think that it sort of goes back to the point I made earlier that, but for a comprehensive bill, I'm not sure that these kinds of provisions would be included in the, you know, I wouldn't say what is in S-744 is comprehensive with regard to refugee and asylum protection, but it is broader than almost anything else we've seen in more than a decade. So my sense is this community is probably not fortunate enough to be in the position you just articulated.
I mean, I think we should take any chance that we get for any kind of reform, whether it's, you know, the small, you know, the NDAA carrying the Afghan and Iraqi provisions. If there's something focused on Syria or something focused on the border that we can get some good stuff into, I think, again, we're not really part of that overall equation. So we should really be looking for opportunities anywhere we can. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be incremental no matter what we do.
Question. Hunter Landrum, Wilmer Hale. We represent the New York City Bar on the access to council issues, and we've been on the ground in the House for quite a while now. And this certainly probably won't brighten the mood in the room. But we have found that as sort of 2014 started, the narrative emerged that we can't trust the administration to enforce the law. And then but now every time any executive action happens that further entrenches Congress, which reduces the odds of legislative action, it's sort of this never-ending circle that keeps anything from happening. We've been trying to work on ways to sort of break through that. Have you guys been thinking about that, and what do you think are the ways to sort of get through that cycle?
Another election to have passed.
The next one's not going to help.
Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, we've been thinking about it, we've been facing it. There's really, it's almost like nothing the administration, whatever the administration is going to do, it's going to be portrayed as, you know, being soft on enforcement or being an impeachable offense or whatever that is. So even things like the trig bars, there were recently a couple of trig exemptions that were, you know, really, I mean, this was something that was a result of a lot of work that the Bush administration did and then the Obama administration. And, you know, it really was a provision that would allow refugees and asylees that are already here to get their status because they didn't, because of minimal, or I mean the language was minimal incidental. This was a bipartisan effort for many years. Even that was portrayed by Representative Goodlatte as some kind of being, you know, look at the president being soft on terrorism. So that actually came as a surprise because that had never been a partisan issue. So you're right. I mean, all I can say is yes, and I don't know, other than trying to find those couple of areas of, you know, of concern where we can get some cover by a few members of Congress in a bipartisan way so that the administration can act more, you know, confidently that it won't get attacked. I think that's helpful. But, you know, who knows how much in the next, you know, 2 years, how much the administration will, you know, pay attention to that, whether they'll go ahead and do what they need to do anyway, it's hard to say. But yeah, they're always going to get backlash no matter what they do. It just seems to be the trend.
Tara, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess I'd just quote the esteemed senior senator from California who said the other day that she recalled Democrats railing incessantly at the imperial presidency of the Bush administration, and now the Republicans are complaining about the imperial presidency of the Obama administration. I think it's politics. It's politics.
And I just wanted to add that I think that, even if that's sort of what you're hearing, keep at it. Because, the fact that, you all are a different messenger, sort of from outside of the immigration asylum field, and you're able to go in and talk about how this makes no sense, from the perspective really of the public or from the bar. I think, don't be discouraged and keep it up. I think it's great, and I'm sure will be very helpful over the longer term.
Absolutely.
Hi, thanks. Just a question on broadening the issue. I know this is something, and Melanie, we've worked with you on this, is taking the issue, and I'm thinking particularly of migration from Central America, children and adults, and broadening it out beyond just an immigration issue to a foreign policy issue. And I know in our experience, recent experience in Congress and meetings, we talk about this, and we mentioned the UNHCR report, and it's showing that the majority of the children should be screened for international protection, but it's not resonating. And I'm just wondering if you've had experience or suggestions from your worlds about how to kind of get that message to stick.
Do you both want to start, and I can chime in as well? I mean, I think it's really important to keep up that message because, clearly, we're dealing with committees and subcommittees who really want to talk about immigration. That's what they talk about, and so, there's a narrative and there are concerns and issues that they're going to be focused on. But I think it's really important to make clear that there are a lot of other factors here. So I think, I wouldn't be discouraged by hearing that, and I think it's important to keep pushing and I think to have messengers, that are not just the usual messengers on that issue. Messengers that are going to be viewed as having, strong backgrounds in law enforcement, strong backgrounds from places not viewed as sort of the usual suspects on the left, looking at Central America or looking at the Americas in general. I think, those are important voices for us to pull into the issue. And I'd be curious, I don't know if USCCB, found at least some resonance in listening from the offices that they went into with their report on children.
I'm not the one to ask. Yeah, I think that sometimes it takes a crisis to get people's attention, and I think we're kind of at that point now with the children and the asylum seekers on the border. I can't imagine that the administration is now not thinking about, well, this is a foreign policy issue. Although we have been raising that for a long time. We're not the foreign policy people. I don't know. We have been trying through this new Central American migration group, which is a very informal ad hoc group of not just refugee advocates, but people who work in the region, to try to come up with a way to frame this as a foreign policy issue, because that's not our area of expertise. But I think this has got to be something that the administration is now seriously thinking about. But historically, the administration has never, not just this one, but has never really paid that much attention to the neighborhood until there's been like a massive crisis that really actually affects our borders, whether it's Haiti or Central America. So I think we're at that tipping point. I would think that this is going to be much higher up in terms of priorities for the administration.
I guess I would just give you teasers on a couple of reports that are scheduled to come out this summer. I think UNHCR has 2 reports coming out, if I'm correct. One out of the Mexico office and one out of the Panama office, looking at the issues of child migration from research conducted within the region. And those are maybe slated for July?
Mexico is the beginning of July, and the other, I guess, will come out for the Cartagena meeting.
Okay.
In Monaco.
Great. And then another report that is will be a book-length study. It's being coordinated by UC Hastings Center on Gender and Refugee Law and a researcher from University of Lanús in Argentina, in cooperation with about 10 NGOs from the 4 primary sending countries of the children, Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, doing very in-depth studies from within those countries about the root causes of unaccompanied child migration. So interviews with consulates, interviews with local NGOs, repatriated children, their families, et cetera. And that should be out in September or October.
Apologies for the multiple questions, but you should take it as affirmation that you're just so interested.
Thank you.
So Mary Small from JRS. I have a question that's connected to both the Central American migration trends and also access to territory. So it seems like there's these increasing trends to limit access to territory, whether it's increased documentation checks before boarding flights or interdiction, or these kind of emerging migration management talks between the US and Mexico. And I'm wondering if any of you think that there's a way to get out in front of that move to limit access to territory for asylum seekers and UACs from Central America, rather than doing what I think we've more often done, which is react to the restricted access to territory by pointing to individuals who weren't able to access safety because of those.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be the global trend, right, is restricting access to territory. I don't know, how we reverse that other than to keep, raising it. But that's a good question. I don't have a quick answer to that, but that is certainly the trend.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a trend that's going to continue. So I think the more that we can, think through ways of ensuring protection in the context of these mechanisms. I mean, I think part of the challenge is, it's now sort of a post 9/11 world, or there's been so many restrictions and safeguards, built into the system to keep out folks who states don't want in. But yet, really, what you're going to look at is a situation where people almost can't leave their own country of persecution, without, a visa, which of course no one's going to give you a visa to go seek asylum. So, it's a real challenge, and it's not just a challenge for the U.S., it's a global challenge, really. I think it's a very good question. Shelley, I'm guessing UNHCR thinks about this all the time.
I was just going to throw out an idea that might be controversial and is certainly far from perfect, but just to address that would be an in-country processing mechanism for children and others in need of protection. Clearly here there would be complications in terms of their security in country. Nothing's perfect. And there would also be the whole challenge of dealing with their family links in the United States who are out of status. Also imperfect, but perhaps there are legislative ways to address that, like you were saying, Melanie, with a particular focus on addressing a particular population of concern. The benefit, of course, would be that would give some incentive to avoiding the dangerous trek. It's not over water, but still, and it would be a little bit of a way to combat trafficking.
And, does this even require legislation, or could it be done administratively?
It could be done administratively, yeah.
Yeah.
And have in-country processing and other locations.
Right, it would be modeled maybe after the Cuban program, where in order to combat Cubans coming over through the water to Miami, they were given an opportunity for 20,000 visas. You could enter, it was a lottery, I think, still going on, and it dramatically reduced or almost eliminated unauthorized migration from Cubans over the border to Miami. So
Haitians too.
Haitians too.
Processing was very effective.
So there's positives, but then there's also, potential negatives as well. I think, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, some of the recommendations being put forward to the administration right now from groups looking at the unaccompanied immigrant children issue are making this exact recommendation, and modeled in part on Vietnam, orderly processing. I think the other point that's worth thinking about here is many of the claims that the children would file are not based on persecution by a state actor, right? There are cases where law enforcement is persecuting children, and I wouldn't say it's not present, but so many of the claims that children file are not related to persecution by a state actor, so one might imagine that that type of program would possibly work well.
Margaret, I think I saw your hand up. I don't know if it was a question or a comment.
Well, it just seems to me that Mexico has a big problem with all these kids too. And you were talking about the report coming out, I think UNHCR in Mexico. Are they going to be dealing with the fact that it's not just a problem for the United States, it's a problem for Mexico having all these kids transiting their territory?
I'm going to look right at Shelley because this is a report that UNHCR funded through other sources. So I don't know
I haven't,
content in great detail.
I haven't seen the draft yet, but we can try to find out, get a little bit of a heads up.
Okay, because you know, if you just think about it, there's lots of interesting security issues related to the, I think everyone who's dealt with some of these kids knows how these things are operating, and you know, there's these huge smuggling networks now that are making more money from getting a kid into the United States than they get from smuggling drugs. So there's this, you know, huge economic incentive now to smuggle kids into the country. It's cost, you know, you make a big profit off it. Huge problem for the Mexican government having all these kids transiting, and it would seem like it's definitely, you know, an international security issue for both countries that would require or would call for some of the same things that you mentioned earlier, you know, like the Cuban problem. They decided to have a parole issue or process in Cuba. So why not have something similar in El Salvador? The president could certainly set a quota for, you know, the number of refugees that they're going to take. And that it might not be a state actor, but I think it's pretty clear with a lot of these cases, it's groups that the government doesn't control. The government in those countries is unable to control. So I think there's room there for advocacy on that.
I think this sort of goes into the package of things that my sense at least is that the administration is very open to suggestions of this type, very creative, far-reaching suggestions as long as they are pragmatic and do not immediately appear to create a giant new pull factor. So something like an orderly processing system might fit the bill.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking like somebody's got an I-130 that's been approved, but they're waiting 7 years. You know, why shouldn't they be allowed to get paroled in like the Cubans do? You know, while they're waiting.
And those recommendations have been made for Syrians as well. So, but I think, again, the time is kind of now coming where the administration is really going to seriously, I mean, they've heard them, but I think it takes a crisis. I mean, and this is kind of at that level at this point. But before, maybe everyone was kind of hoping those numbers would be wrong and it really wouldn't be this many kids. But now it's unavoidable. I mean, it's obvious that this is a real crisis, and the president just said that it was.
So my closing question to both of our distinguished panelists is one that Don encouraged me to make, and I would ask anyway, is you know, what kind of role do you think the group that is convened here today, both in terms of the very learned writers who have written such excellent pieces that help to inform our discussions, as well as those who are here and committed and interested. What thoughts do both of you have in terms of how those of us here today can continue to stay engaged and involved and help make a real difference on these issues?
I think it would be great if we all got on the same page and we're pushing for the same few things. I know that's probably a challenge for us because we've been talking about all the challenges in Congress and the government and our systems and our gaps. But you know, if we could really come up with some kind of a strategy and gain momentum and have something to get behind, whether it's, again, focused on a particular crisis, picking a few things that we really want to get changed, and we have consistent messages and we kind of build a movement. Again, we're not going to be as big as the movement for legalization. We just don't, you know, it's not that kind of a personal imperative for so many people. But I think we have enough that we could probably have an impact, but we're all working on different aspects of the issue. So it's kind of hard to get that, what is the solution? There are so many different things that are broken that need to be fixed. If we could ever decide, well, these are the three things that we want to do now, I think we'd gain a lot more momentum. So whether it's behind a piece of legislation that, you know, is targeted maybe at the UAC issue, because that is kind of the big crisis right now, and something that we all in this room, I think, have focused on. If you know, all the panels were touching on it. That could be helpful to really have something we can all mobilize behind. I think that would be a good way forward.
I would agree with that. I think the one thing that has, I think, become very clear in the last few months is the challenge of educating policymakers and members of Congress and staff who have not previously been familiar with these issues. And so I think, you know, everyone knows that members of Congress and congressional staff in particular have dozens of issues they handle every day. They don't often have the luxury of, say, coming to a conference like this and spending a single day looking at one issue or set of issues. And so I think for those of you who do go up on the Hill, you probably realize that each conversation really starts at ground zero. And so, you know, I've been joking with my colleagues at MacArthur, you know, we don't fund lobbying, obviously, but I don't think any of this really counts as lobbying. I don't think anyone has the luxury of lobbying yet. I think it's really basic education. What is the population? Why are they fleeing? What are the protection needs? What does the law say? What does our law already say that we are responsible for doing for these groups, whether they're the children, the asylum seekers, et cetera? I think spending some time educating staff and members could not be more important now, and that is not just committees of jurisdiction where people tend to have a little bit more time to develop expertise and study an issue, but also appropriators in particular, because the children's issues are putting so much pressure on the budgets at the moment. Appropriators have really woken up to the issue, and so I think for some of these issues, flying under the radar was not a bad strategy for a long time. Because issues weren't particularly controversial, they were funded, not perfectly, but reasonably well, and I think those days are over. And so for anyone with the interest or time, or anyone who's represented by any member of Congress, is sort of the time is now to just engage in some basic education of those policymakers, because otherwise the narrative really does have potential to go in a negative direction.
I totally agree with what Tara said, but I also want to point out that, very few staffers on the Hill were like Tara, who could come up with their own solutions. So to have a couple of really concrete recommendations for people who aren't going to be able, you can present the issues, but it's helpful to be able to say, these are the things that we really think would fix the problem. I think that drives the conversation forward. It's not just about describing the problem, it's about putting forward some proposed solutions. Because unfortunately, we don't have enough Senator Leahy's on the Hill now that can really do the thinking on their own. We need to do a lot of the thinking ourselves and make those suggestions and proposals. And hopefully be consistent about what we're asking for.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you very much, Melanie. This was a really great discussion. And thank all of you for your participation. And Don, I think final thanks from all of us who are here today, and thanks to CMS for hosting